This place, which was more of a tranquil haven for those who valued calm over excitement, was where everyone knew each other's business, or at least believed they did. Weekends were frequently spent alone for Jacob's father, a man of few words, because he worked long hours at an offshore job. I observed that Jacob spent a lot of time at home in his early adulthood, but I didn't mind the solitude because I had grown accustomed to it over the years. Being 51 and single had become my norm, and the prospect of finding someone had become more of a pipe dream than a realistic expectation. I've always thought of Jacob as a young boy, the boy next door, who would occasionally wave at me when I went for my morning walks or talk to me about school and his developing interest in music. He was a good kid, courteous and respectful, but during the past year something changed in him. It wasn't a sudden change, more of a gradual shift in his demeanor, and I was unable to ignore the subtle looks, the fleeting glances when I was walking around in the garden, or the way his smile seemed to linger just a bit longer than it had before. At first, I thought I was being overly sensitive. After all, I was a 51-year-old woman, certainly far removed from the interests of an 18-year-old boy. Yet something told me this was different. It wasn't just the polite neighborly affection one would expect from a young man. It was something deeper, more charged. The more I thought about it, the more I became aware of the heat in those glances when Jacob's father was away. It was just the two of us, and the silence between us would stretch on thick with unspoken words. There were moments when I would catch Jacob staring at me, and it made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. His eyes would linger just a little too long before he quickly looked away, almost as if he had been caught. But when our eyes would meet, I could see it the way his pupils would widen, the subtle softening of his expression, and the faint blush that would creep across his cheeks. It was all so innocent on the surface, but I couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to bubble beneath it. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was lonely, or that I was reading too much into simple gestures, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was changing between us. It was a slow build-up, the kind that surprises you when you least expect it. What did this mean? Was I imagining it? Or was he actually looking at me the way a young man might look at a woman, the way one might look at someone they found more than just interesting? It wasn't until one weekend, when Jacob's father was away for his regular work shift, that I made the decision to do something I never thought I'd do. Perhaps it was loneliness, or perhaps it was the way Jacob had been acting, but I invited him over for dinner, the kind of dinner you make when you're bored and looking for company. And when he arrived, I was taken aback by how anxious I felt. I had prepared a simple, modest meal, but as soon as he walked through my door, I realized how much I had been waiting for this moment. We sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed naturally. At first he talked about school, his future plans, and the music he loved. But as the evening went on, the conversation became quieter and more intimate, and we discussed life, growing older, loneliness, and the passing of time. I could see him looking at me differently now, really looking at me, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Dinner ended, and the mood shifted. The moment was fleeting, but it lingered. Jacob noticed the leaky faucet in my kitchen, and I almost without thinking asked him to help me fix it. It wasn't much, just a minor inconvenience, but somehow his offer to fix it felt like a turning point. As he worked, I found myself watching him. His hands were steady, precise, and his movements seemed to slow down as he adjusted the pipes. I had always seen him as just a boy, but in that moment I realized that he was no longer just a kid. He was growing up, changing, and maybe he was seeing me differently as well. The next few moments were almost surreal. As he worked under the sink, I handed him an old shirt to wear to keep from getting dirty. It was simple, practical, but as he changed into the shirt, I couldn't help but feel an inexplicable flutter in my chest. His figure looked different now, more grown-up, more attractive in a way I hadn't fully realized on, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that things between Jacob and me were changing after dinner. I offered to clean up, but he insisted on helping. We worked side by side, almost in sync, the easy companionship turning into something more, the hum of the dishwasher, the occasional clink of a plate, the soft shuffle of feet as we moved around each other. It was intimate, but without the pressure. I was starting to feel at ease in a way I hadn't before. That's when I mentioned the faucet again. It had been leaking for days, and I knew it was something Jacob could fix. Without much trouble, he agreed. Of course, and we moved into the kitchen. I didn't expect the situation to escalate the way it did as Jacob worked. I stayed close, offering guidance and giving him tools when he needed them. There was a small exchange of smiles, a shared moment of laughter when he accidentally dropped a wrench on the floor. But as the work continued, I could feel the tension building in the room, almost like the air had thickened. It happened. Suddenly, a loud burst echoed from under the sink, followed by the rush of water spraying everywhere. Jacob cursed under his breath, trying to stop the flow of water. I rushed to the kitchen, heart pounding, and that's when I saw him standing there drenched from head to toe, water dripping from his clothes in steady streams. His face was pale, his body glistening with water, and for the first time I saw him in a new light. The sight of him caught me off guard. His clothes clung to him, his form outlined in the dim light of the kitchen, and something stirred within me. Something I couldn't ignore. I asked him to come into the bathroom to dry off, offering him a towel. But when he looked at me, the expression in his eyes changed. "I'll be fine," he said, but his voice was low, almost too calm. "But could you come help me? I think I need to clean up. I'm pretty filthy." I hesitated, but I gave in. I led him to the bathroom, and without saying a word, he started taking off his wet clothes in front of me. I could feel the tension between us, and the air was heavy with something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, before I could stop myself, he asked me to accompany him inside. It was an innocent request, but it carried a weight that I couldn't deny. The bathroom was warm, and the steam from the shower created a thick haze that seemed to envelop us. Jacob had entered the shower first, and for a few minutes I stood there with my pulse racing. I could hear the water rushing as it poured over him, his heavy breaths mingling with the soft sound of the bathroom fan. There was no doubting the attraction I had begun to feel, the quiet yet intense connection that had developed between us over the past year. But this time there was something different. The way he looked at me now was something more profound, something that spoke of shared intimacy and vulnerability. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened, the tension, the way his clothes had clung to him, the request for me to join him, and what was happening between us. My breath stopped as I approached the shower and saw him standing there with water flowing over his toned body. He turned to face me, and for a brief time I could not ignore something in his eyes that made me realize he was no longer simply a youngster. I saw him as a guy who had developed before my own eyes, someone who had always been there but now seemed to have a power I hadn't completely recognized. His voice was quiet, almost whispery, and he stared at me, asking if I would come in since it was the only way I could become clean. For a short minute, I thought about denying, since I had never envisioned this, certainly not with Jacob. But I also couldn't deny how my body responded to the circumstance. "You said you help," and there was a calm sincerity in his tone. I entered the shower with my feet slipping slightly on the wet tiles and moved toward him. The warmth of the water surrounded me as I reached out and took the washcloth from his hand and started to gently clean him. I could feel the pulse of our shared intimacy between us, the way our breaths matched, the way our bodies were close enough to feel the heat radiating from each other. The vulnerability of the moment was overwhelming. There was a part of me that wanted to be closer to him, to explore this connection, this magnetic force that seemed to pull us together. He let me gently wash his back while I traced the contours of his muscles. There was an innocence in the way he allowed me to take care of him, a quiet acceptance in his eyes as he let me do something so intimate that should have felt strange, but instead felt perfectly natural. Then, as I turned him to face me, I could see the expression in his eyes, something raw, something longing. We were both naked, not just physically but emotionally, standing there in the steam, sharing this intimate, raw experience. I felt the weight of it all, the trust, the tenderness, and I realized that in a way this was more than just physical attraction. His lips parted, and without saying a word, he leaned in slowly at first, as if waiting for my reaction. My heart raced as he got closer, his breath mingling with mine. Instead of pulling away, I closed the distance between us, bringing our lips together in a gentle, tentative kiss that wasn't rushed or a straightforward exchange of affection, but rather slow and deliberate, as if we were both tasting the moment and trying to make sense of the emotions that had built up between us. His lips were warm. For a brief moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside the bathroom vanished, and it was just the two of us, standing in the steam, lost in this shared moment of vulnerability and trust. When we finally pulled away, my breath was shallow, my heart thumping in my chest, and the air between us felt thick with unsaid words. His touch was gentle as his hands came to rest on my waist. I could feel the strength in his body, the quiet power in the way he held me, and I responded in kind, allowing myself to sink into the kiss, into the connection that had developed over time. I looked at Jacob, and he looked back at me. His expression was a mixture of surprise and something deeper that I couldn't quite name, but I knew all the same. He whispered, and I acknowledged that my voice was just as shaky. We stood there for a long time, letting the gravity of the situation sink in, neither of us knowing exactly what to say next. In the end, it didn't matter, because we had shared something far more profound than words could express. I finally stepped back, turning off the water, and we stood there for a moment longer, just staring at each other. It seemed like the kiss had opened a door, and even though I wasn't sure where it led, I knew we couldn't go back. After putting a towel around his waist and exiting the shower, Jacob gave me a quiet, intense gaze, and for the first time I realized that the young man inside of him was no longer the kid next door, but had transformed into someone completely different.